Okay. Well, let me begin by trying to, in effect, review what we did last week before we go on to something new. My assumption, and that's what we're working from here now, is that the authors of both Mark and John believe that in Jesus, you've had the key to understanding God, human life, and what the past, present, and future was all about. They saw that as the key. Now, Mark, being the first one, decides he's going to communicate that vision. Well, how do you communicate a vision? Well, Mark decides the best way to communicate it is through telling a story. So he comes up with a narrative to tell the story that he thinks will evoke in the reader who Jesus is all about and what it means. Well, what narrative do you pick? And the assumption is, which I'm assuming too, is that Mark was living around the year 70 when the war was taking place or had taken place briefly between Israel and Rome. And that war kicked up a lot of apocalyptic frenzy in people. And so the narrative that goes back to Ezekiel and others, that in the end times a war would take place and that God would radically intervene and take care of the evil in the world and restore the world back together again, was the narrative that made sense to the author of Mark. And so he decides to put Jesus into the apocalyptic narrative. Whether Jesus really fits there or not is an open question, but that's what Mark decides. And so Mark believes the key to understanding what Jesus is up to is his baptismal experience, which we looked at last time. At baptism, he goes into the water. His old ordinary self dies in the water, and he emerges with a new self, a self that is now empowered by God. And his mission from that point on is to fight against the evil in the world led by Satan and Satan's demons, which are creating physical and mental diseases all over the place and have, in fact, infected the political authorities who are also corrupt. So Mark is now watches Jesus moving into history, fighting the battle that God wants him to fight against the forces of evil, to destroy them, and ends up with the message that he will return and complete the process. So that's Mark's vision. And that's the way he tells the story. And everything is geared for that story. Now, the author of John comes along, maybe 20 years later or so, we think, and he doesn't have an apocalyptic vision. So I'm assuming he reads Mark and says, no, that ain't right. There's something, that's not the right way to understand what Jesus was up to. It's difficult to pin what cultural situation the author of John was in, but he was obviously learned and with relate to great philosophical thought with some of the elements that were going on in the Roman religions. He understood Jewish mysticism. So he's coming out of a whole different environment, if you will, than is the author of Mark. He has the same vision in the sense that Jesus is the key, but he's got to find a different narrative to explain what he thinks Jesus is all about. So he picks what, for lack of a better term, you would say, is revelation material, in which the sole purpose of Jesus in the Gospel of John is to make God known. Because remember in the opening prologue, the Logos, which is now incarnated into Jesus. He's the Logos. The Logos has created the world, but the world remains in darkness and ignorant of its creator. And because of it, all kinds of chaos is happening in the world. And the purpose of Jesus is to come to reveal God's reality, to bring people back into greater harmony and love with God. So John sets out to try to create a narrative which will express that. So we have two different people with visions, both of whom are seeking to communicate. And as with any vision, whether it be Paul's or anybody else's, every time you put something like a vision into language, it distorts it. It's because the vision is something that can't be fully rationally explained. And so every attempt to do so both helps and hinders the process. The best that kind of language is like poetry or metaphor that points you toward whatever that reality is, but doesn't try to say what it is, because it's a realm in which the equivalent would be to say to somebody who says, I'm in love, prove it. It's not the kind of thing you can prove any more than if somebody says, I've had an experience of God, prove it. You're going from vision to analysis, and that both hinders and helps it when you do that. And that's so the authors are struggling to try to put into language what they believe is the truth. And that's the struggle they're having. So we have two different visions, and to say one right or one wrong, one may speak to you and one may not. That's really the better way to look at it. Or some parts of it will speak to you and other parts will speak to you, and so forth. So that we're looking at, and the same thing would be true if we were looking at Matthew or Luke or the Gospel of Thomas or Mary or whatever else we're looking at in those texts, or if we're looking at Shakespeare or anybody else. They're all trying to portray in language some vision that they have. So that's what we're up to. Okay, let me, before I get on to today's material, see whether that anybody has any questions about that or anything. You're either all asleep or docile.
Expectantly.
Okay, all right. Let's look at, I want to look today at one of the big differences between Mark and John. And that's the structure of the Gospels themselves. That is, Mark has a series of sequential events culminating in the crucifixion and the claim that Jesus will come back again, where it ends. One of the events that comes toward the end of Mark's gospel, and is in some sense a culminating event in the sequence of events that he tells, is the incident that takes place at the temple. So we're going to look at that section of Mark. This is in chapter 11, starting with the 15th verse. The context that he's put it in, Jesus says, triumphantly entered into Jerusalem the day before. He doesn't do anything on that day, he just enters Jerusalem. Then in Mark, on the second day, as he's going in, he curses the fig tree, which this is one of these intercalations, fig tree, story, fig tree again. So the fig tree and curse is an indication that judgment is on its way in. And the judgment in the middle is the judgment over the temple. So Jesus goes into Jerusalem and then to the temple for this, by the way, this is the only time in Mark Jesus goes to Jerusalem. John has him go there 3 times for 3 Passovers. So this is another big change between them. So Mark, you have a 1-year ministry, and John, you have a 3-year ministry. He goes into the temple for the first time in the gospel. He enters the temple and begins to drive those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturns the table of the money changers and scats on those who sold drugs. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, now look at this. As far as we know, the best is something did happen with Jesus in the temple. What Mark is up to, as he is in the whole thing, is he doesn't have Jesus to ask, why'd you do that? What were you up to? What vision of God or the temple did you have that you did this? So Mark's got an incident that happened, and now he's going to try to figure out why Jesus would do such a thing. He doesn't quote Jesus. Who does he quote? Isaiah. He quotes scripture. So the best interpretation Mark can come up with is to go back to the prophetic tradition. In this case, Isaiah, and quote Isaiah saying, my house shall be called a house of prayer for the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. Well, what's going on in the prophetic tradition? Perhaps the best, it's interesting, the passage you quote in Isaiah doesn't fit what's going on here, because the passage in Isaiah is about how God is pulling the people back from exile, take them to go home, and no matter who you are, whether you're lame, whether you're a eunuch, whatever you may be, you're now welcome to pray with God in the temple. It's an opening to bring the temple into a sense of harmony for everybody. That's not exactly what's going on here. This is more like what's going on in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah has an angry response about let me see if it's in Jeremiah 7, if I can find it. Here, in Jeremiah 7, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, stand at the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim this word and say, here is the word. Here is the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, you that enter the house, the gates of worship of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and let me dwell with you in this place. Do not trust in the deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the Lord. The fact that it's the house of God isn't in itself the right answer. It's what you do and how you act toward people for Jeremiah that matters. If you're just going to say, well, this is God's house, so we can do whatever we want to after that. If we'll go to church on Sunday, we can do whatever we want to the other 6 days of the week. That ain't going to work. And that's what Jeremiah is concerned about. Now, when you do what Jesus is doing, knocking over the money changers, taking all the animals out of the temple, what the heck are you accomplishing? Think about it. What are the animals there for? And what are the money changers there for? What's going on?
Well, they have to use special money.
They what?
They have to use special temple money.
Right. Temple money has to be used. So if you're going to
buy their sacrifice,
you have to change your money into the currency. That's right. So that's all proper for the temple to be doing. What else? What are the animals there?
they're for sacrifice.
For the sacrifice. Well, if you're kicking out the animals and you're kicking out the money changers, what are you doing? What are you preventing?
Saying no more sacrifice.
No more sacrifices. That's that's wrong. Instead, it should be a house of prayer. That changes the whole function of the temple, because its primary purpose, particularly at Passover, is the sacrificial lamb and bringing your own animals to perform your own sacrifice and keeping half of it for the Passover meal. That's being stopped. That leads me to think the notion of the atonement theory that becomes so important in the church is not in Mark. Mark's against sacrifice. Jesus' death replaces the whole sacrificial element of the temple. It's over. And what he wants instead, I think the best passage to understand what he's up to is in the book of Amos, back to the prophetic tradition. This is Amos. In the prophetic tradition, by the way, the prophets always saw the king and the high priest and the temple authorities, which were the elite, operating together against the interests of the common people. The prophets speak for the common people against the elite. That's why they get in so much trouble. And it's in the process of this that Amos says the following: I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. The offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Justice and righteousness are what to replace what's going on in the elite who are in control of the temple. I think that's what Mark has in mind for Jesus. Jesus challenges what's going on in the temple, and just as the prophetic tradition of Israel had done. So that's where Jesus fits in Mark. He's an apocalyptic prophet, fighting against evil and injustice. That's the apocalyptic message. And so he throws the temple out of whack, in effect, and shuts it down, and offers instead a whole series of teachings instead of that, which is a way of bringing it back to what he thinks it should be. So the cleansing of the temple ends then by saying, and when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him because the crowd was spellbound by his teachings. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out. So the incident at the temple is the major factor in Mark leading to his arrest and crucifixion. So the temple, unfortunately, in Mark then, is aligned with the opposition forces, and therefore needs to be replaced. It's no longer going to function as God's house. And he will tell the parable of the wicked tenants in here to say that once they kill the son, God will remove them. He tells a parable in the middle of this to show why the temple's got to go. But then I want to take you over to Mark 13. In the midst of his teachings, he ends up across the valley from the temple. He comes out. Jesus says, do you see these large, great buildings? Not one stone of them will be left upon the other, and it will all be thrown down. That's, of course, what happens in the war with Jerusalem. The temple is knocked down. And when he's sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter says to him, tell us when all these things are going to happen. And then from this point on, you get a whole chapter about the end times. The apocalyptic end is coming. War will take place against nations. These are the beginnings of the end for Mark. That's what he says in verse 8. And he tells people what's going to happen to them. Beware in verse 9, for they will hand you over to councils. You will be beaten in synagogues. and you will stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. All of that's what's happened to Jesus, and what happened to Jesus is now going to happen to his followers. Okay? Then he goes on to say, the temple, that there'll be which is what Epiphanes did in the 2nd century BC, puts an image within the temple, which is to Zeus. False messiahs will come, people will lead you astray. Then in 24, in those days there will be suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, the powers will shake, and the Son of Man will come back with clouds. That's the apocalyptic image you find in Daniel. So Mark has adopted the apocalyptic language narrative that he finds in many texts, and now applies it to what's happening to Jesus in his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and what's going on with the temple. It is to be destroyed because it's being replaced. And he finishes to say, the apocalyptic has started. No one knows exactly when it will end. Not even Jesus knows that, only God knows it. But Mark does say there's a time limit. He says, therefore, at the end of the 13th, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes. Only what I say to you, keep awake, because this is the last generation of people, he says, who will live on earth. 20 years later, John can read that and say, that wasn't right. But Mark thinks there's a time limit. So he thinks the time has started. The destruction of the temple is part of the beginning of the final apocalyptic move, which will end before this generation leaves. And the temple is no longer the place where you will find God. You will find God in the righteousness and justice that Jesus is bringing into the world. Okay? That's so Mark places the temple incident as the movement toward which Jesus says the temple is no longer functioning the way it should. It needs to be replaced. It will be knocked down and it will be destroyed. And what will replace it is God's action of bringing justice into the world ultimately. Okay? Any comments or questions about what Mark's up to?
What is he saying that's going to look like, though?
He doesn't say. He doesn't say what it'll be look. So part of the question that in Mark is he going to have a reformation on the earth? That is, we're going to get a new earth. Everybody's going to, all the righteous, who are going to be saved, will be back on earth in a perfectly Eden-like situation? Or are they being whisked off and taken up into the stratospheres to a new place in heaven? We don't know. Doesn't say. John's clear he wants to get up to heaven. He wants to get out of here. It's not quite clear. In many of the apocalyptic texts, the earth is to be reformed as a place of Eden again. So you have the beginning of time and the end of time agreeing with each other in the place of Eden. But Mark doesn't say that. He leaves it open. Yeah.
Is this tying back of the story of Jesus to the ancient Old Testament prophets an important issue for Mark?
What about it?
Well, it seems to me that he keeps emphasizing that Jesus is here to fulfill this piece of prophecy or that piece of prophecy as he's going along.
Yeah, as I see Mark, he sees Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet who fits into the prophetic tradition of Israel and is now bringing it to a culmination. And that is what he's been commissioned by God to do at baptism.
And that the people that Mark is writing for would know that the earlier prophecy. Is that right?
I assume he's writing for a Jewish apocalyptic group that will become part of the Christian movement too. That's the best guess. That's what we're up to. Any other comments or questions about any of that?
Well, it's a mark, because it has, sort of describes where we are today. It sounds very familiar. That,
Well, the chaos is still here, but the apocalypse isn't. So, yeah, so we're still struggling with what do we do about evil in the world?
okay.
Oh, that's a problem. But the narrative that it'll be taken care of by an apocalyptic end, that died out after the 2nd century. It didn't have any credibility for people. So it died out. And then they changed the idea. Well, it'll happen after 1,000 years. The year of 1,000 became another apocalyptic movement. The year 2000 also, if you remember, because of the clock was going to create a problem.
Right.
2000 also, so the notion that 1,000 years like a day in God's sight, every 1,000 years sort of kicked it up again. But basically the apocalyptic Christian became so discredited that after about centuries, you don't see that happening again.
But it's climate
Except
change.
in the
We're going-
19th century, the Millerites started it again, became the Seventh-day Adventists. They started it. They thought they had, in the 19th century, they were counting up all the days from creation in the Bible
Wow.
and claimed that the 19th century was the day that it would all end. So the Millerites, when it sold their property, waited for the end to happen. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Vicky. Oh, are you muted? Oh, no.
No, I'm not.
Oh.
I unmuted myself. I wanted to pick up with what Peg was talking about, and ask, is this why sometimes I think that Mark is referred to as a failed gospel. I've heard that before in some of my Bible studies with Presbyterian women. Would that kind of have been some of the reason for the writing of John?
I think what fails in Mark is the assumption that the end is going to happen within the next
Okay.
20 years.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
The narrative structure around it, the apocalyptic Christian being discredited. But if Jesus is a prophet fighting for justice and righteousness, that vision hasn't changed. But then you need to put that into a different narrative for the 21st century. But that part of the narrative would still be appealing in a different context. But yeah, as I read John comes along 20 or more years later and says, this ain't the last generation. The whole apocalyptic tradition is not the narrative to understand Jesus. We got to find a different vision. So that's what he's doing. Okay. Well, John now also takes the incident of the temple, but places it not at the end in Jesus' ministry, but at the very beginning of his ministry, right after the changing of the water and wine comes the temple incident, this first trip to Jerusalem as he opens his ministry. So let's look at the Gospel of John. You have the wedding in Canaan, and then the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So this is his first shot at going to Jerusalem. But let's back up. Why is he following this incident in the temple with the previous story of the changing of the water into wine? Why put those together? Well, if you look at this, at the issue of the story of wine, you get to verse 11. It says, Jesus did this, changed the water into wine, the first of his signs. In Greek, semeia. John is clear that what Jesus performs are signs. You could say metaphors, images, symbols. They are not meant to be taken literally. If you take the story of changing the water into wine literally, you haven't understood it. It's symbolic of something. You need to struggle with the symbolic nature of it. So John has introduced into his text the notion of signs, which is another way of talking about his language problems. He has incidences, but if you take them literally, he thinks you won't understand them. So he's trying to say to you, look for what this symbolizes. Then he takes in the Passover story and look at verse 18. Jesus said to them, what sign, the Jews are asking, what sign can you show us? The Jews think of sign as something you should literally perform to prove your authority. Jesus sees signs as something should awaken the vision behind the language. And look at 23. It says, when he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. The people see something more than the literal events. So the context of chapter 2, and it will come up again more and more in John, is you've got to look for what's behind the language. And the language is saying these are symbols, these are signs of something taking place that point you to the reality. And the problem in John's gospel with Nicodemus and others is when he says, again, you got to be born again, the wrong way to understand that is literally. The right way, it's a sign for some other meaning, getting back to God again. So the problem with John's language, Jesus speaks the language of above. Unless you were born from above, you won't get it. So Jesus talks all throughout the whole gospel, Jesus is talking about languages above, and everybody who listens to him thinks he's talking about rather ordinary language. And so there's a constant misunderstanding between the people and Jesus, because Jesus is using language to point to something that can't be said in language. Nevertheless, to communicate, you have to use words. But watch, so chapter 2 sets up the fact that what you need to look for in this text and in what Jesus did is a metaphor or symbol of God's reality that's behind all of this. It's then that we need to look at what's going on with the temple incident for John. Let's go through it. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers sitting at their tables, making a whip of cords. He drove them all out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He poured out the coins of money changers and overturned the tables. So far, he's pretty much in agreement with Mark's vision. They're great. Kicked out the temple and overthrows the money changers. He told them who were selling doves, take those things out of here. Stop making the Father's house a marketplace. Well, that's a change of language here. It's not a den of thieves. You're making it into an economic selling place. John was not a capitalist. So he thinks you've turned it into a business, which it shouldn't be. That's another form of making it something that's wrong. But he doesn't say den of thieves, he says marketplace. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will confirm it. So even the disciples trying to make sense out of it, and Mark quote scripture, because they don't know what Jesus got in his mind. But let's go on. The Jews that said to him, what sign can you show us for doing this? They want proof that he's got the authority to do this. Jesus answered him, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews said to him, the temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in these 3 days? Now, interesting. In Mark's gospel, in the trial scene of Jesus, false evidence is given that Jesus said he would destroy the temple. Mark picks it up, Matthew agrees with it and has them testify that Jesus said he would destroy the temple in 3 days, rise it up, all of which is a false claim against Jesus. In John, he takes the thing out of Mark and puts it in the mouth of Jesus. Jesus says, yeah, I'm going to do that. Well, he's obviously not talking literally about the temple, is he? He's not going to destroy the temple and raise it in 3 days. So he goes on, in case you didn't get it, the gospel says, but he was speaking of the temple of the body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this and believed the scripture word. So what is being replaced? The temple is being replaced by the body of Jesus. Not his physical body. Remember, he's now the incarnated Logos, who is the creator of the whole universe and is everywhere. So let's go over to John 4 now. This is when he's talking to the Samaritan woman and talking about worship and its meaning and so forth. He's talking to the woman. I'll start with verse 20. Jesus said to the woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as those that worship him. The temple is being replaced now with the language of spirit and truth. In John, there isn't going to be any physical one place on earth that God is located. The house of God is not going to exist any longer. What is replacing it is the cosmic body of Jesus that's everywhere. And it's the spirit and aletheia in the word truth in Greek is aletheia, which is a revelation. Truth is a revelation in the Greek language. So spirit and truth it's a revelation of the cosmic presence of God anywhere. This changes the whole structure of religion as for John's language, as opposed to, say, most other religion of the time. Most all other religions were building some place on earth to locate where God would be found. You go to the temple, you go to the synagogue, you go to the mosque eventually, you go to St. Peter's Cathedral, wherever it may be. There's a place you go to the community church in Davis. And this is what technically it's called situated religion. You situate the structure of religion in a particular place, and it becomes a sacred place. And you go to that sacred place because it's different than other places. That's the most common way in which religion is practiced around the world. There are sacred places, just as there are sacred times. There are special times, Christmas, Easter, whatever, when you find God. John says no to this. Every place is sacred because every place belongs to the cosmic body of the Logos. It can be found anywhere, at any time. Anytime you're moved by the Spirit, or when you have a revelation of truth, you have experienced it. John has changed the whole structure of what the religion ought to be now. That's part of his vision of things. That's what the cosmic presence in the prologue is all about. He starts the cosmic presence before the creation, has the gods there, has the creation, and then said, tragically, the world preferred ignorance to truth and gave up the notion of spirit and proceeded to follow along lines that lead to chaos and evil. So if you understand the sign, the symbol, the metaphor of chapter 2, you are being pointed into a new direction of what God's reality is all about and what Jesus reveals. That's John's point of view. So he has a different vision than Mark and has to come up with a different language. He turns to the more mystical, philosophical traditions to come up with this language. And he turns almost to literature, metaphor, and poetry, if you will, to try to come up with the language to point toward his vision. These are two different ways of trying to make sense out of things. Okay? Any questions about John's view of the temple or why the incident took place as opposed to Mark?
Well, the temple's already been destroyed.
The temple is already down and gone by
It's
John's
gone
time.
by the time he's writing.
And he's now explained why it's going to go. It's going to go because it no longer functions the way it needed to be.
So in a sense, by turning it into this cosmic kind of a thing, he's giving everybody back the essence of God.
Yeah, he's taking everybody back to what they should have known if they had known the Creator.
So John's, is it similar to Panentheism?
I think that's probably stretching it a bit. He doesn't get into the pantheist and the panentheist position. Pantheism, the cosmos is God, period. There's no difference. In panentheism, God is in the world, but is not identically to the world. God has another mysterious element that the world doesn't have. It's difficult to know which way John would go in that one. He doesn't get into that debate. His debate is simply opening up the fact that God's reality is here. And they should be able to experience it. That's what the author of John has experienced it. So he's trying to say, this is what everybody should be doing. And in that case, the other religious life, which situates God in some particular special place, that's not the right way to understand this. That vision is wrong.
So Jesus, obviously, and so in John, what Jesus says is purposefully enigmatic, or like parabosis. He wants each individual to perceive and experience in their own way.
I think what Jesus is deliberately confusing people with his language because he's not talking the language that everybody else is.
Right.
And that's deliberate because that's the only way you can communicate something beyond what your language is pointing to. So if you understand language here correctly, my language is like poetry or like metaphor. It's pointing you to something other than the language itself. But the problem is if you get stuck with the language, you're going to lose it. For those of you who are the dream group, this is the difference between the right brain and the left brain.
You're right.
The right brain is a visionary experience, who wants to see wholes and relationships and presence. The left brain wants particular structure, item, specificity. And so what you have in John is the right brain experience saying to the left brain, stop translating me in a way that destroys the right brain. It's the wrong way to go. Whereas the people in the text all want to go to the left brain, and so they can prove it. Give me a sign, prove it. That's left brain language. John is right brain language. Mark starts out with right brain visions. He keeps trying to tell things and he gets stuck when he gets literal with the apocalyptic tradition. He gives in too much to the left side, if you will, in defending it. But nevertheless, his vision is still coming out of the right brain. Yeah.
So raising Lazarus, how would John explain that?
I'll say it again.
When Lazarus was raised from the dead, when he healed Lazarus,
What is the symbol of Lazarus being raised from the dead?
Yes.
If you take it literally,
Yeah.
you're not going to get it.
I'm wondering, how should I get it?
But okay, what does coming back from death mean symbolically?
Life.
It means death's not the final answer. There's something more than that. Life wins out in this debate. And so you see this also in when Jesus in his last meeting with his disciples in chapters 13 through 17. In my Father's house are many mansions. That's where you've got to go. That's where life will end you, in your Father's house, up in the sky, not in the grave. So Jesus, right after Lazarus, will say, I am the way and the life. That's language of metaphor. It doesn't mean literally you won't die on earth. You do. But is there something beyond that life? And in John, he thinks there is. And so Lazarus is an example of God's power at work in which life supersedes death. That's what happens in Lazarus.
I have a question. This is Vicky. Now, a lot of John's, I think this brings us to a good point about a lot of John's writings have been interpreted literally.
Yes.
Used to hurt people in horrible ways.
Yes.
When they talk about the Jews.
Yes.
So, what are we to do with that? Just
the problem with the conservative tradition in Christianity has been to make religion into left brain experiences, definitive creeds, definitive symbols or sacraments that mean literally something, so forth. So that the fundamentalists from the 19th century on became the most rational to try to counteract the rationalism of science with a new form of rationalism. And in so doing, they have made the text into something that works for evil. And that is the anti-Semitism in the gospel. Every time you take John too literally, you distort it, what it's up to, and you turn it into something that's against itself. And that's happened all the way through. Now, John does have problems with the Jewish community, no way around it. And they were being kicked out, so he's angry. And he does say in the text, "Your devil," to the Jews, your father's the devil. So there is some harsh stuff in there. And if you take that as the final word, then you're going to distort the whole dang thing. It simply it represents the anger between two communities, but it's not the final answer. The final answer in John is love.
Right.
So, but you're right. That text has been used. How many football games can you see without a sign saying John 3:16? Literally.
Mm-hmm.
To take that literally doesn't means you don't get it. So John is at least struggling with the language problem. John's trying to find a language to say language can't be left brain, literal, analytical, detailed. It's got to be something that points you beyond that to the reality behind it. Mark's trying to do that too, and he thinks the apocalyptic narrative will do that. But sometimes the apocalyptic narrative gets too rational. It gives you too too many facts that you have to pin on. But that's not what Mark wants to do. Mark wants a vision which the apocalyptic image opens up the mystery of God's reality and intervention in the world. And the apocalyptic language was for Mark, the way to talk about God coming into the world and making it better. So if you get stuck with Mark's apocalyptic language, you're also going to miss what Mark's up to. Well, if that hasn't thoroughly confused everybody. I won't go, I was gonna go on to the next scene would be, well, we'll come at it next week, but take this and you look at the text yourself. In Mark, I think in chapter 6, he has the walking on the water, then he has the feeding of the 5,000. John has both of those stories in the same order. Walking on the water, feeding of the 5,000. What does Mark's gospel think is going on in walking on the water and feeding the 5,000? And what does John think is going on with the walking on the water and the feeding of 5,000? Those are texts you can look at, chapter 6 in both of them, I think. Look at them, read them carefully and see if you can see the differences in language between the two gospels, pointing to the two visions that they have. Okay? Okay.
Well, I want to thank you for that, the John, because I may have mentioned before, I can't remember, but I was really wanted to find out what it meant to be born again. I really wanted to know. Nobody would tell me. And so I went to the passage and I saw what John said that Jesus said. And it was very interesting, but it was not at all clear. Nicodemus wasn't very happy about it because he wanted to really know what that meant.
Well, the Greek word to be born again is anothen. And it has anothen. It means, it can mean above or it can mean again. Jesus, in John, Jesus means you got to be born from above. Anothen, up there, go back to God. Nicodemus here is, I got to be born again from my mother, literally. There's the misunderstanding of the language.
Okay.
And the language is ambiguous, deliberately.
It involves water.
Yeah, so that you will move in the right direction, but you got to pick it up. You got to see the poetry there.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, well, we'll feed the 5,000 and walk on water next week.
We wouldn't be having the city